November 27, 1944, near the Moselle River, France. A Red Cross nurse lay dead beside a medical tent that was clearly marked from more than 300 yards away. The German officer responsible didn't deny it. He didn't claim confusion. He didn't claim it was an accident. Instead, he told witnesses that anyone helping American soldiers was an enemy. 3 days later, General George Patton received the report at his forward headquarters, while freezing rain hammered against the windows and artillery thunder rolled across the Lorraine front. Patton read every page. Then he read them again. Around him, veteran officers waited for the explosion they expected. It never came. Instead, Patton quietly set the report on his desk and asked a single question. When the answer came back, every man in that room knew something had changed. Because what Patton decided next would follow that German officer all the way to a war crimes tribunal. And what he finally said to him face to face would leave the room in complete silence. What happened next has never been fully told. Until now. But the most shocking part wasn't that a Red Cross nurse had been executed. It was what the German officer said when he was finally brought face to face with General Patton. A sentence so cold that even veteran officers in the room never forgot it. November 1944, Lorraine region, northeastern France. The sun disappeared before 4:50 in the afternoon, leaving the battlefield under a gray sky that seemed to press down on the earth itself. The temperature had fallen to 29 degrees Fahrenheit. Freezing rain mixed with mud along the banks of the Moselle River. Every step sank into the ground with a wet sucking sound. The smell of diesel fuel, wet wool, and cordite hung permanently in the air. General George Patton's Third Army had been fighting for 122 consecutive days since the breakout from Normandy. More than 60,000 casualties had already passed through its ranks. One of the men still standing was Private First Class Daniel Mercer. Mercer was 21 years old. He came from Dayton, Ohio. In the breast pocket of his field jacket, he carried a folded photograph of his fiancée, Margaret Collins, taken outside a church 6 weeks before he shipped overseas. He had been in Europe for 97 days. Every Sunday, if artillery allowed it, he wrote her a letter. On the morning of November 27, Mercer was attached to a supply detail operating near an Army medical station, marked with large Red Cross flags visible from the air and from surrounding hills. The station was staffed by doctors, medics, and Army nurses. One of them was Lieutenant Eleanor Whittaker, a 27-year-old Army Nurse Corps officer from Des Moines, Iowa. She had spent the previous 18 hours treating wounded infantrymen brought in from the front. The Geneva Convention protected her. Everyone knew it. The Americans knew it. The Germans knew it. The Red Cross flags existed for one reason: to tell every soldier on every battlefield that the people beneath them were not targets. Then everything changed. Shortly after noon, witnesses reported that a German officer and several soldiers approached the area during a brief clash between forward units. The medical station was clearly marked. No artillery was falling nearby. No active firefight surrounded the tents. Yet, according to statements collected afterward, the officer ignored the markings. Moments later, shots rang out. When the firing stopped, Lieutenant Whittaker was dead. Mercer arrived minutes later. What he saw stayed with him for the rest of his life. The nurse's medical bag lay overturned in the mud. Bandages were scattered across the ground. One wounded American soldier was still calling for help. Nobody answered. For several seconds, Mercer simply stood there, unable to move, unable to understand what he was seeing. The Germans had not attacked a machine gun position. They had not attacked a tank. They had not attacked armed infantry. They had killed a Red Cross nurse. Word spread quickly through the sector. Anger spread even faster. By nightfall, the incident report was moving through military channels toward 3rd Army headquarters and toward General George Patton. Patton had commanded thousands of soldiers like Daniel Mercer, young men exhausted by months of combat, young men who needed to believe that some rules still existed in a world increasingly defined by death. If those rules disappeared, discipline disappeared with them, and Patton understood that better than most commanders. As darkness settled over Lorraine and freezing rain hammered against canvas tents across the front, investigators began collecting witness statements. What Daniel Mercer did not know yet was that one witness had seen the German officer's face clearly enough to identify him by name. And by the time that officer realized the Americans were building a case against him, it was already too late to stop what was coming. November 29, 1944, Lorraine, France. A bitter wind swept across the frozen fields before dawn. The temperature had dropped to 24 degrees Fahrenheit. Thin ice covered puddles left by days of rain. In a stone farmhouse being used as a temporary command post, Army investigators worked under dim lantern light, reviewing witness statements collected from the medical station. Outside, artillery rumbled in the distance. Inside, a different battle was beginning. The German officer identified by witnesses was Oberleutnant Karl Brenner, 36 years old, born in Munich in 1908, a veteran of Poland, France, and the Eastern Front. Before the war, Brenner had been a schoolteacher. By 1944, he had become something else entirely. Records later recovered showed he had joined the Nazi Party in 1933 and earned repeated commendations for aggressive anti-partisan operations in occupied territories. Behind that bureaucratic language hid a darker truth. Villages burned, hostages executed, prisoners shot without trial, and each time Brenner received promotion rather than punishment. The war had taught him a dangerous lesson. Rules were for weaker men. Success erased everything. For years, that belief had protected him. Now it was about to betray him. At 7:13 that morning, investigators interviewed a wounded American corporal who had survived the attack. Corporal James Harlow stared at the table before speaking. Investigator, was the Red Cross visible? Harlow, visible. You could see it from half a mile away. Investigator, are you certain the officer saw it? Harlow nodded. Harlow, he looked directly at it. The room fell silent. Then another witness was brought in. Private Daniel Mercer, the same young soldier from Dayton, Ohio. Mercer still carried Margaret's photograph in his pocket. He hadn't slept more than 3 hours since the killing. Investigator, did you hear the officer say anything? Mercer swallowed hard. Mercer, yes. Investigator, what exactly? Mercer looked down. Mercer, he said, anyone helping American soldiers is part of the enemy. The investigator stopped writing, then slowly looked up, because that sentence changed everything. An accidental death could be argued. A misunderstanding could be debated. A deliberate statement of intent could not. Meanwhile, more than 20 miles away, Karl Brenner remained unaware of what was happening. He believed the chaos of the front would bury the incident. He believed witnesses would disappear. He believed no one would care about a single nurse, while thousands died every week. He was wrong. At 3rd Army Headquarters, Patton received the preliminary report shortly after noon. Most commanders would have reacted with anger. Patton reacted with calculation. He read every statement. He reviewed every timeline. He studied every witness account. Then he asked only one question. Can they prove intent? The legal officer answered immediately. Yes, sir. Patton nodded once. Nothing more. No shouting. No threats. No speeches. Only a decision. The evidence file would be expanded. Every witness would be interviewed. Every document would be preserved. Every detail would be recorded. Because Patton understood something many officers missed. Battles ended. Records remained. Then came the shocking discovery. At 4:42 that afternoon, intelligence officers intercepted German paperwork abandoned during a retreat. Inside was a field report bearing Brenner's signature. The document referenced the incident directly, and its wording stunned everyone who read it. Rather than denying responsibility, Brenner had justified the killing. In writing, signed, dated, filed, he had handed investigators exactly what they needed. For a long moment, nobody spoke. The only sound was the scratching of sleet against the farmhouse windows. What Karl Brenner did not know yet was that his own signature had just transformed a battlefield accusation into a prosecutable war crime. And by the time he discovered what the Americans had found, Patton was already preparing the next move. December 3, 1944, Lorraine, France. A dense fog covered the countryside before sunrise. Visibility dropped below 100 yards. The temperature hovered at 26 degrees Fahrenheit. Frost coated abandoned vehicles along the roadside, and the smell of wood smoke drifted from shattered farmhouses that had somehow survived months of fighting. At 6:17 that morning, an intelligence courier arrived at 3rd Army headquarters carrying a packet marked urgent. Inside were documents recovered from a recently abandoned German command post. The officer who opened the file immediately understood its importance. One document carried a familiar signature, Karl Brenner's. Another contained something even more dangerous: names, unit designations, dates, and references to previous actions against civilians and medical personnel on the Eastern Front. For the first time, investigators realized the nurse's execution might not have been an isolated crime. It might have been part of a pattern. The discovery was rushed to Patton. The general sat behind a field desk covered with maps, supply reports, and casualty figures. Rain tapped against the windows of the farmhouse headquarters. Patton removed his reading glasses. Read the report once, then again. His jaw tightened. Nothing else moved. Around him, staff officers waited. Nobody spoke first. Finally, Patton looked up. "What do we know for certain?" The intelligence officer answered carefully. "We know Brenner ordered the shooting." Patton nodded. "What else?" "We now have evidence connecting him to similar incidents in Russia." Silence filled the room. Patton leaned back slowly. The room smelled of wet wool, cigarette smoke, and coffee that had been sitting on a stove for hours. Every officer present understood the significance. This was no longer a single battlefield crime. This was potentially the record of a repeat offender. And then Brenner made the mistake that destroyed any chance of escape. 2 days later, during a German withdrawal near the Saar River, American forces captured several members of Brenner's own command group. Among them was Sergeant Otto Weiss. Exhausted and hungry, Weiss agreed to talk. What he revealed shocked investigators. According to his statement, Brenner had openly discussed the nurse's execution with his officers. Not privately, not secretly, openly. One witness remembered the conversation almost word for word. "Officer, sir, the building was marked." "Brenner, I know." "Officer, those were medical personnel." Brenner shrugged. "Brenner, then they should not have been helping Americans." "Officer, that violates the convention." Brenner stared at him, then smiled. "Brenner, only if someone survives to complain." The statement was signed, witnessed, verified. For investigators, it was devastating evidence. For Brenner, it was catastrophic. At 8:41 that evening, the complete file reached Patton. The general stood near a wall map showing 3rd Army positions stretching across eastern France. A single lamp illuminated the room. Outside, artillery flashed on the horizon. Inside, nobody moved. Patton read Weiss's testimony. His expression never changed, but those who knew him noticed something else. The stillness. Patton was most dangerous when he became quiet. He placed the papers on the desk, folded his hands, and made a decision. Find him. Just 2 words. Nothing more. No speech. No angers. No debate. Find him. For 11 seconds, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The only sound was the ticking of a field clock hanging beside the operations map. Then the room exploded into motion. Orders were issued. Intelligence units were alerted. Prisoner records were reviewed. Every available lead was pursued. Because Patton now had exactly what he needed: evidence, witnesses, intent, and a target. But what nobody inside that headquarters knew yet was that Karl Brenner's capture was only days away. And when Patton finally stood face to face with the man responsible, the confrontation would become one of the most chilling moments of the entire campaign. December 11, 1944, 3rd Army headquarters near Nancy, France. A freezing wind rattled the windows of the stone headquarters building, as military police escorted Karl Brenner through the front entrance at exactly 2:18 in the afternoon. The temperature outside was 27 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside, the atmosphere felt even colder. For nearly 2 weeks, investigators had assembled witness statements, signed reports, intelligence files, and captured German documents. Every piece pointed to the same conclusion. The execution of Lieutenant Alina Whitaker had not been an accident. It had been a deliberate order. Now the man accused of giving that order stood in American custody. Brenner looked thinner than his photographs. His gray uniform hung loosely from his shoulders. His cheeks were hollow from months of retreat, but his eyes still carried the same arrogance described by witnesses. He believed he could explain his way out. He believed soldiers would understand soldiers. He underestimated the man waiting inside. At 2:24 p.m., General George Patton entered the room. Every conversation stopped. The room contained military police, intelligence officers, legal investigators, interpreters, and 2 senior staff officers. Nobody sat. Nobody smiled. Patton walked slowly to the center of the room. Brenner straightened. The interpreter stepped forward. The confrontation began. "Patton, you are Oberleutnant Karl Brenner." "Brenner, I am." "Patton, you commanded the unit involved in the incident on November 27. "Brenner, I commanded many operations." Patton stared at him. "Patton, answer the question." "Brenner, yes." The room fell silent. Patton picked up a document, one of the signed witness statements. "Patton, this nurse was unarmed." Brenner said nothing. "Patton, the medical station was marked." "Brenner, war is not always clear." Several officers exchanged glances. That answer shocked them. Even now, Brenner refused responsibility. Patton remained perfectly calm. "Patton, the Red Cross markings were visible." "Brenner, she was aiding enemy soldiers." Patton's eyes narrowed. Brenner continued. "Brenner, anyone helping the enemy becomes part of the war." A dangerous mistake. The room immediately changed. Every person present felt it, because Brenner had just repeated the same justification witnesses had reported weeks earlier, and he had done it directly in front of investigators. Then came the unexpected revelation. One intelligence officer stepped forward carrying a newly translated German field report, recovered only the previous evening. The document contained Brenner's signature and another order involving medical personnel on the Eastern Front. The room became absolutely still. For 8 seconds, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The only sound was the crackling of a coal stove in the corner. For the first time, uncertainty crossed Brenner's face. He realized the Americans knew far more than he had imagined. Patton looked at him for a long moment. Then he said something so quiet that the interpreter had to ask him to repeat it. He repeated it. Every person in that room remembered those exact words for the rest of their lives. Patton said, "You are not standing here because war is cruel." The room remained silent. Patton continued, "You are standing here because you made a choice." The interpreter translated. Brenner swallowed. Patton never raised his voice. "You saw the Red Cross." Another translation. "You knew exactly what it meant." Another translation. "And you gave the order anyway." The silence became unbearable. Then Patton delivered the sentence nobody forgot. "You are not a prisoner of war." A pause. "You are a war criminal." Another pause. "There is a difference. You will learn what it is." Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Brenner's confidence vanished. For the first time since entering the room, he looked away. Before we go further, drop a comment right now. Should Patton have gone further, or did he cross a line? Tell us below. The meeting ended minutes later. Military police escorted Brenner away. But as the door closed behind him, investigators received new intelligence from captured German records. Evidence suggesting that the nurse's execution was only one part of a much larger pattern. And if the documents were authentic, Karl Brenner's worst problem was no longer Patton. It was what a war crimes tribunal was about to discover. January 1945, Luxembourg. Snow covered the roads leading east toward Germany. Temperatures dropped below 20 degrees Fahrenheit at night. The Battle of the Bulge still raged across parts of the front, and thousands of American soldiers were fighting and dying every week. Yet amid the chaos, the case against Karl Brenner continued to grow. Patton had made sure of that. The evidence file now contained witness statements, captured German documents, intelligence reports, and testimony from members of Brenner's own unit. For investigators, the question was no longer whether a crime had occurred. The question was whether they could prove command responsibility beyond doubt. That was harder, much harder, because war crimes trials were not battlefield encounters. They were legal battles, and legal battles required evidence. Not anger, not rumors, not assumptions. Evidence. Every statement was reviewed, every signature examined, every timeline verified. Military lawyers knew that one mistake could allow a guilty man to walk free. Then political complications began to appear. Some Allied officials wanted rapid prosecutions. Others worried about setting legal precedents that might later affect Allied officers. Governments agreed that war crimes must be punished, but they disagreed on exactly how. The machinery of justice moved slowly, sometimes painfully slowly. Meanwhile, survivors continued giving testimony. One of them was Private First Class Daniel Mercer, the young soldier from Dayton, Ohio, the same soldier who had arrived at the medical station minutes after Lieutenant Alina Whittaker was killed. On February 8, 1945, Mercer sat before investigators and described what he had seen. His hand shook slightly as he spoke. Not from fear, from memory. Investigator, what do you remember most? Mercer looked down at the photograph of Margaret he still carried, then answered quietly. Mercer, the silence. Investigator, what do you mean? Mercer swallowed. Mercer, the shooting stopped. Then everything was silent, like nobody could believe what had happened. The room remained quiet. Mercer's testimony became part of the official record. Another piece of evidence, another voice, another witness. And then the verdict phase began. Months later, after Germany's surrender on May 8, 1945, Brenner's case entered the expanding Allied war crimes system. The findings were devastating. Witnesses confirmed intent. Documents confirmed knowledge. Orders confirmed responsibility. The conclusion was unavoidable. He was found guilty. The sentence was death. He never hanged. The decision immediately triggered appeals, reviews, and political debate inside the occupation authorities. Some sentences were upheld, others were reduced. Some convictions became entangled in larger Cold War considerations that were already beginning to reshape Europe. Justice, it turned out, was not as simple as a courtroom verdict. When news of the outcome reached former Third Army officers, reactions were mixed. Some believed Brenner deserved immediate execution. Others believed the legal process itself mattered more than the punishment. Patton never saw the final outcome, but witnesses remembered his reaction when updates from the investigation reached headquarters during the war. One staff officer later recalled finding Patton alone late one evening. The general stood beside a map table. No audience, no speeches, no reporters, just silence. Patton reportedly looked at the evidence file and said, "The dead do not return because a sentence is passed." Then he closed the folder and walked away. Outside, snow continued falling across Europe. Inside courtrooms and legal offices, prosecutors prepared more cases, thousands more, because investigators were beginning to uncover something larger than anyone had imagined. A network of crimes stretching far beyond one nurse, far beyond one officer. And the deeper they looked, the darker the truth became. What the public did not know yet was that even after convictions were secured, many men responsible for wartime atrocities would never face the punishment their victims expected. And that dark twist was about to change everything. Summer 1946, Germany. The war was over. The gunfire had stopped. The Third Reich was gone. Yet for many survivors, peace felt strangely incomplete. Across occupied Germany, Allied investigators continued opening files, interviewing witnesses, and tracking former officers who had vanished into the chaos of defeat. The deeper they looked, the more disturbing the picture became. Karl Brenner was not unique. He was one of hundreds, perhaps thousands, men who had hidden behind uniforms, ranks, and battlefield confusion. The public expected swift justice. Reality proved different. Political priorities were already changing. The alliance that had defeated Hitler was beginning to fracture. The Cold War was emerging. New enemies were appearing. And suddenly, some governments became more interested in the future than the past. Many war crime sentences were reviewed. Some were reduced. Some prisoners were released years earlier than expected. Others disappeared into administrative confusion. The machinery of justice continued turning, but it no longer turned with the same urgency. For families of victims, that truth was difficult to accept. For soldiers like Daniel Mercer, it was impossible to forget. Mercer returned to Dayton, Ohio, in late 1945. He married Margaret Collins the following spring. He found work, started a family, built a life, yet certain memories never left him. For years, he avoided discussing the war. When friends asked about France, he changed the subject. When his children asked what combat was like, he gave short answers. Very short answers. But every November, according to family recollections, he became quieter, more reflective, as if a particular memory had returned. The image of a medical station, a fallen nurse, bandages scattered across frozen mud. Some wounds never healed. Meanwhile, Karl Brenner's story moved toward an ending filled with irony. By 1952, according to fragmented post-war records, he was living under supervision in a small town in western Germany. The proud officer who once commanded armed men now worked behind a desk. The man who believed power protected him spent his remaining years answering questions from investigators, lawyers, and occupation authorities. Not a dramatic ending, not a cinematic execution. Something worse, a long decline, a life reduced to paperwork, scrutiny, and public disgrace. On a cold morning in February 1961, Brenner reportedly died in relative obscurity. No military honors, no parade, no celebration, just a small funeral attended by a handful of people. The location was a modest cemetery outside Koblenz. Rain fell throughout the service. Most of the town barely noticed. For a man who had once believed history belonged to him, it was an astonishingly small ending. And yet even that ending left uncomfortable questions, because not every victim received justice. Not every witness was heard. Not every criminal was found. Entire files disappeared. Some names were lost forever. Others were never recorded at all. Even Lieutenant Alina Whittaker's story survived only because investigators preserved enough evidence to reconstruct what happened. Without those records, she might have become another forgotten casualty buried beneath statistics. That unresolved truth haunted many of the men who worked these cases, including Patton's former investigators. Years later, one legal officer reflected on the experience. "We proved what happened." Then he paused. But proving it and repairing it are not the same thing. That was the hardest lesson of all. The law could establish guilt. The law could impose punishment. The law could preserve the truth, but it could never undo what happened on that freezing afternoon in Lorraine. And as the years passed, one final question remained unanswered. A question that George Patton himself understood better than most. Why do some men obey the rules of war under impossible conditions, while others choose to break them? The answer to that question would become the true legacy of this story. December 1945, Luxembourg American Cemetery. Winter had returned to Europe. A cold wind swept across rows of white crosses stretching toward the horizon. Thousands of American soldiers rested beneath them. Men who had crossed oceans, survived battles, and paid the final price for victory. Among those graves would eventually lie General George S. Patton himself. Not among politicians, not among famous commanders, among his soldiers, exactly where he wanted to be. By the end of the war, millions were dead. Entire cities had been reduced to rubble. Empires had collapsed. Borders had changed forever. Yet history often turns on moments that seem small at the time. A report on a desk, a witness statement, a signature on a document, a commander deciding whether a crime mattered. That is why the death of Lieutenant Eleanor Whittaker did not disappear into the chaos of World War II. Someone wrote it down. Someone investigated it. Someone refused to look away. When Patton first received the report, he could have treated it as another tragedy among thousands. No one would have blamed him. The front was collapsing and reforming daily. Entire divisions were moving across Europe. The Battle of the Bulge was approaching. Every hour brought new emergencies. Yet he stopped. He read the report, and he demanded evidence. That decision changed everything, because justice begins with documentation. Without records, there are no witnesses. Without witnesses, there are no prosecutions. Without prosecutions, there is only memory, and memory fades. The world that emerged after 1945 understood that lesson. The Geneva Conventions were expanded in 1949. New protections were established. New legal standards were created. Military commanders throughout the world were reminded that rank did not place them above the law. The principle was simple. A soldier is responsible for his actions. An officer is responsible for his orders. And a commander is responsible for what he allows. Those ideas remain the foundation of international humanitarian law today. They exist because millions suffered when those principles were ignored, and because investigators, lawyers, soldiers, nurses, and commanders insisted on preserving the truth. That is the real significance of what happened in Lorraine. Not merely the punishment of one German officer, not merely the anger of one American general, but the idea that even in the middle of humanity's darkest war, some rules still mattered. Some lines still existed. Some crimes could not simply be excused as the cost of battle. Lieutenant Eleanor Whittaker never returned home to Iowa. She never saw peace. She never knew that her death would become part of a larger fight for accountability. Yet her story survived, and because it survived, the principle she died under survived as well. The right of medical personnel to remain outside the violence. The right of the wounded to receive treatment. The obligation of armies to recognize humanity even in war. Years after the conflict ended, veterans of the Third Army were asked what made Patton different. Many spoke about his aggressiveness, his speed, his determination, his famous speeches, but a few remembered something else. They remembered the moments when he became quiet, the moments when he stopped performing and started deciding. One of those moments occurred when he looked at a report describing the death of a Red Cross nurse and said, "See that the record is complete." Later, standing before the officer responsible, he delivered another sentence that echoed far beyond that room. "You are not a prisoner of war. You are a war criminal. There is a difference." More than 80 years later, those words remain a reminder that justice is rarely perfect. Sometimes it is delayed, sometimes incomplete, sometimes frustrating, but it begins when someone refuses to let the truth disappear. And that is why this story is still remembered today. Not because of vengeance, not because of revenge, but because somebody insisted that the rules were not optional, and because one nurse's sacrifice helped ensure the world would never forget why those rules exist. And perhaps that is the most important lesson of this story. Not that one war criminal was eventually caught, but that in the middle of history's deadliest war, a single report, a single witness, and a single decision ensured that the truth could not be buried. Because when the shooting stopped, what remained was not revenge. It was accountability.